So welcome everyone. My name is Sandra and I'm the lead patient research partner for the Alberta Spore Support Unit Patient Engagement Platform. I'm very excited to present this, not me present specifically, but to introduce our session today. There's a few of us actually from the Patient Engagement Platform that have taken the digital storytelling workshop out of Berkeley or the Story Center in Denver, Colorado. And then recently I completed my facilitator training program this summer through the Story Center and have the pleasure of working with Rani now out of Story Center, Canada. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that although we are meeting virtually, each of us live on the traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence and enrich our vibrant community. I'm pleased to welcome you today to the session on storytelling for policy and health system impact. I would like to just go over a few housekeeping items. So this session is best viewed in speaker view, not gallery view. Rani will be sharing slides and videos today. Please keep your video camera off to ensure your privacy and to prevent interference with your audio. To access reaction buttons such as thumbs up, click on participants at the bottom of the live stream window. You will then see the reaction icons at the bottom of the participants tab. And I think also if you're on a Mac, it's just on the bottom bar, you will see a little happy face that says reactions. So you can click on that and choose your reaction. If you have questions, please post them in the Zoom chat box. We also have Diane Aubin here from the Alberta Spore team helping to moderate the session and the questions here today. If you experience any technical difficulties, the best first step is to exit and then rejoin this session. You can also post questions in the chat box. Nope, not. We're not going to be in Whova today. We're staying in Zoom, so just put everything in Zoom. This session is being recorded, and you can watch the recording later when it gets posted to Whova. So our speaker today is Rani Sanderson, who is the Canadian Projects Director with Story Center Canada. Rani has been facilitating digital storytelling workshops and other community engaged arts workshops for more than 10 years. She develops and implements workshops for nonprofit organizations, universities, public health organizations, and individuals across the country. So Rani, I'm going to pass the baton over to you and you can take it over from here.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to add also that I am based in Toronto. I am on the traditional land territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Mississaugas of the credit, and the Anishinaabe. And we are Treaty 13 land. So thank you for that. So I'm going to be talking mostly around using storytelling for research, actually. Oh, I have to get my things going. So this is sort of a little quick overview of what I'm going to try and cover today. I got a little ambitious, so hopefully I can get through most of it. I will be showing you some stories, some digital stories along the way. Oops. So this is a nice quote that I like that came from my professor who actually introduced me to digital storytelling in the first place when I did my graduate studies back in 2007. And I used it for my own research. So I feel like I can talk about it properly. Just very briefly, Story Center has been around for almost 30 years and now in Canada for about 6. And as far as we know, our founder, Joe Lambert, coined the term digital storytelling back in like 1991, 92. Now it's used in a variety of different ways, but I'll specifically be talking about the Story Center definition and method. Digital storytelling, for those of you who are not familiar, is a community engaged arts practice that brings small groups of people together to share personal stories in a workshop setting where we work hard to ensure a safe environment for our storytellers, which I'll talk a bit more about later. Their stories are then turned into 2 to 4 minute multimedia videos that use photos, video clips, and other digital art forms to illustrate the storyteller's personal story or lived experience, which is spoken almost always, which I'll talk about later also, in their own voice. As I said, I'll show a few stories throughout the presentation. Stories I tried to find from a health research perspective, and I've included stories from patients or subjects of research, as well as one from a researcher to see what that looks like. So we're looking at how stories can be used. So this is our little chart about how they can be used once they've been made. And just to be clear, The visual model you'll be looking at is there's like a lot of overlap between these circles, and they don't necessarily happen in any particular order. But I'm going to go over most of these kind of quickly so I can concentrate on the final two, which are more what this presentation is about, though I'm happy to discuss these others in more detail in a Q&A if anybody has any questions. So this first circle is around the impact on the storytellers or participants of our workshops themselves. And I'd also like to add that this could include leadership development also, along with personal reflection and growth, allowing people to share and bear witness to their stories of their own struggles and successes, and at the same time, listen to those stories of others. There we go. Next, we've got education and awareness, which also looks at individual level change, but frames change as the potential result of listening to or watching stories as opposed to telling or creating a story. Personal stories are immensely useful tools for supporting the transmission of information and skills and can speak directly to specific audiences. They can bring awareness to an issue and be shared throughout a community to educate people on a specific topic. Movement building expands out to look at how sharing stories can support community-wide change. You could also call this community building and mobilization. And without getting into a lot of theory, our work in community has really shown that with skillful facilitation, community story screenings can generate deep and strategic discussions about relevant issues and function as an opportunity to map out local strategies for how audience members can mobilize and take action on specific issues. And then these are kind of what we're here to talk about today. Policy advocacy describes the impact that digital stories can have at the policy level. So in an ideal world, people would have ample opportunity to express their concerns and needs, and their voices would directly inform public policy debates. But unfortunately, as we know, highly manipulated data and special interests tend to dominate in the policy realm. So we found that stories created in our workshops can bring the concerns of those who are typically overlooked into the policy arena, whether we're talking about public policy as in legislation at the local, provincial, or national level, or whether we're talking about institutional policy of health organizations, schools, or other civic or community groups. For example, I did a project in Thunder Bay a couple years ago called the Thunder Bay Friendly Giants, which had seniors telling stories about aging at home as a way to gather information directly from the seniors to assess how organizations and the city of Thunder Bay could support and help seniors in their homes or age in their homes. And it gave insight into what the storytellers needed to keep them safe and comfortable aging at home. And they actually got policy changed because of it. And they got some stuff to help the seniors. And finally, we don't necessarily limit our attention to the value of policy change to the enactment of new policies. We've also seen how the stories can be very useful as a way to inform the public about particularly policy changes that have been enacted and how these changes may affect their lives, and that the stories can contribute to training strategies intended to ensure that those responsible for policy enforcement are held accountable for their role. And finally, the fifth circle here is research and evaluation, which I think is what the main focus of this will be. And although research and evaluation approaches can play an important role in all four of these circles we've just gone over, I'm going to speak about it slightly separately. Digital storytelling is becoming more and more common in academic and organizational research, either as a qualitative methodology or form of data gathering, or a way to analyze, assess, and or evaluate programs, which we'll talk about a bit later. Plus, groups of stories can also tell a broader story of an issue and shed light on a specific topic, and are a great tool for qualitative research. So I'm going to start with showing you what a digital story is and what a story told and made by someone who's experiencing a medical issue, which is pain, can look like. This is Meredith's story. Meredith has MS, and this story allowed her to not only talk about and describe her pain in words, but also through visuals and sounds. So we worked with her to find one specific example or moment of how she experienced pain, which explains a much broader idea of her pain and how it manifests, plus how it makes her feel emotionally too.
Awake in the dark, my thoughts are racing. Did I turn off the oven? I hope that meeting tomorrow goes well. I check my watch. It's 2:46 a.m. and I have to pee again. Spasms race down my back as I struggle to push myself up from the bed. My left foot reaches for the floor. It's just a few steps to the hallway, but my feet are numb and cannot make the journey. The quicksand floor disorients me and I fall. Landing hard, the swamp has turned to unforgiving cement. Bursting into tears of pain and shame, I realize that I cannot get up. I am stuck here. I thought I had more time than this. It's only been 4 years. 4 dizzy and exhausted years. 4 numb and tingly years. But a year ago, I needed a cane to walk. And tonight I can't even make it to the bathroom. I cry out for help, thankful for my husband nearby. He makes sure I didn't hit my head or break anything. He helps me to my wobbly feet and guides me down the hall.
So that's an example of what a story can look like. So these are just some sample projects that in the health arena that Story Center Canada has been and Story Center in the US have been a part of, or that I've been directly involved with. The last few are ones I am currently working on. So it's a variety of different ways people are using stories in health related projects, whether it's research or other health related work. So why stories? And specifically why personal stories and digital stories. So storytelling is becoming increasingly popular in research. Digital storytelling can help facilitate experiences into focused, shareable stories, which can then be analyzed or assessed in various ways. So we know a lot about this, so I'm just going to go through this part quickly because I think you're all here because you like to use stories or you've thought about using stories. So stories are universal. People everywhere tell them and listen to them, of course, in a variety of unique ways. In order to understand themselves, their communities, and the larger world, stories are the best tool we have for understanding what it must feel like to be someone else. A good story has power to inspire, to move people to action. Good stories have the power to build understanding, change ideas, and teach. Stories can bring a face to statistics and numbers and humanize an issue. Most importantly, good stories have the power to be remembered. So they're great for knowledge transfer and publicizing your research in an accessible way. Community and personal storytelling is a powerful methodology to enable marginalized voices, including women, girls, youth, LGBTQ+, Indigenous communities, newcomers, refugees, survivors, and more, to reflect on their experiences and help them understand who they are, which brings me to stories are democratic. They lessen the distance between the expert and audience. They don't tell us what to do. They tell us what it was or is like. Personal stories can decenter the researcher or interviewer. So storytelling and research can lend itself to participatory engagement in research and intervention design and help build trust. Having people tell their own stories in their own voice allows storytellers to trust that their story will be exactly as they want it to be, that they will have control over how they are represented, and give researchers a more honest and authentic point of data. The people you are working with will be more likely to trust you and to feel that their input and viewpoint and story are valid and worthwhile, especially in more marginalized communities who traditionally may not be given a platform to voice their ideas, opinions, or even just be who they are authentically. And they're engaging. Metrics and statistics are important, but they're hard to engage and connect with and very impersonal. A personal story can be a bridge between individual experience and collective action. And a good story can build empathy. So through these personal stories, especially a collection of stories, you as a researcher can get a great overview and insight into an issue or research topic from an insider's perspective. And then why digital storytelling? So there's always room for stories to be shared orally, and it's often nice to pair spoken stories like presented live with digital stories in your research. But here are a few benefits of using digital stories. They're short. The compact length of digital stories or short oral stories and their ability to like zero in on an important issue makes them ideal for educating and influencing leaders and decision makers. Using well thought out prompts can really get your subjects or storytellers to focus on a specific moment and keep people from rambling. It's also about a process. So the process is as important as the final outcome. People share a lot during the story circle part of our method and throughout the whole workshop process, a lot of which doesn't necessarily end up in their final stories. This process can also be a part of your research. Workshops can happen in person and remotely through something like Zoom, and both work well in different ways. Our typical in-person workshop is 3 days, and it can be rather intense, but it allows people to get to know each other quite well. And it also gets people to really focus on themselves and their stories over those 3 days. But that doesn't always work for everyone. So our standard online workshop takes place over as 2 hours a week over 6 weeks, which, you know, now in COVID is working better for us because we can't gather. And for some people who may have certain health issues, being in a group is unsafe, or they get tired easily, or they feel more comfortable in their own home or space. So having an online option works really well. Spacing things out also allows, over 6 weeks, allows more time for people to process and reflect on their stories. And we found actually that people are making incredible stories in our online workshops, both in their scripts and visual choices. When we work with a group, our workshop design is fluid, and we always work with our researchers to make the right decisions for what's going to work with their work and their people. So they're easy to share because they're little, you know, digital files, which you can upload to anything or put on your social media. And you don't always need to have the storyteller present to share their stories. Or if they are, they might not necessarily be comfortable speaking in front of a crowd, so they can show their story and then talk about it. Again, digital storytelling, the stories can be anonymous. So digital stories can still allow for someone's story to be told in the way they choose, but without necessarily identifying who they are, depending on what your research is. Stories can create intimacy. We found that through our work, stories told in the first person voice can help create a further sense of intimacy that engages viewers. Dialogue spoken in the moment or lush descriptions of what someone has gone through. These aspects of what we identify as the quote personal truth touch hearts in a way that third person reporting or lots of facts and figures and statistics like those that point, for instance, to quote forensic truth just can't. Numbers can be impressive, but they can be hard to connect with. A personal story gives a face to an issue and humanizes it, making it much more relatable. As I've already mentioned, digital storytelling is a great form of qualitative research method. And again, it's also a great way to disseminate your research findings in an accessible manner. The last point here really refutes the idea that a story must convey a singular quote message or set of messages. The beauty of a well-told narrative story lies in its subtlety. It may include important information, but it also shows scenarios, evokes emotion, and invites reflection instead of sounding demanding or preachy or bossy. So if you invite your research subject to just tell their story how it was and not impose a specific result, and that their story does not need to be all wrapped up in a bow at the end. Sometimes people are still like in their story, so they can't simply end with, you know, or they can't finish them completely with a happy ending. So they might just end with like a ... or a question kind of feeling. This way you'll get a much more honest account of what they went through if they're not trying to force an ending. When specific understanding or actions are hoped for, though, as a result of watching a story, these meanings or actions can be encouraged in discussions through training activities and in supplemental information shared alongside the story, so that information about what people need to learn or do doesn't have to be part of the story. It can just be next to the story. So a lot of people would attach a blog post, for example, or a written piece that goes with the digital story. Stories can be used in your research as a catalyst to a conversation about a specific issue, a conversation which can then be used as qualitative data, because stories sort of spark other stories. And once people see something, they tend to move on with adding their own stories. It's sort of an opening and makes people very comfortable. Not only are these points reflected in our various storytelling approaches, but as a facilitator, I bring awareness of them directly into the way that I interact with workshop participants around the contents of their stories. We talk specifically about bringing out unique scenes and details and about the implications of language and, where relevant, image choices in terms of issues of media representation. We also talk about the power they have to make conscious decisions about how storytellers present themselves and how they talk about their communities and the issues they're facing, with an emphasis on situating their individual experiences within a broader social and political context. This last point is especially important as it helps us avoid setting up a dynamic that suggests that individuals alone are responsible for their lives. Rather, as with a public health approach, we want to point to structural factors that interact with individual agency and choices. And generally, you want to keep things short and sweet. In a world of shorter attention spans, shorter stories have more chance of being watched than a longer one. People will likely click on a 5-minute video and even watch 2 or 3 of them, but not click on a 10-minute video, even though they'll spend just as much time watching it. So I'm going to show you another story. This is Tegan's story, which was made in a workshop at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in New York. She's a graduate student there, and the students were asked to make a story about why they were interested in pursuing a career in public health, or how they had a personal connection to the work that they were doing in their research. So often we like to ask that researchers also make a story before they use digital storytelling in their work, so that they know what it feels like and will be able to understand what they're asking people to go through, since it's a very specific process. It also allows researchers to really reflect on their work and why they choose to do it. So here is Tegan's story.
I don't think I could ever live in a home with white walls. I hearken back to the white walls of my grandmother's hospital room, the same white walls closed in my grandfather's hospital room every time he ran a bad fever, and finally the hospital walls I found myself looking at through tear-blurred eyes 2 months after I started college. The white bandages they wrapped around my arms, wrist, and thumb made me match the scene and feel like something between a mummy and a voodoo doll. On a Sunday in October 2015, I went into anaphylactic shock and found myself shivering in an emergency room without an idea of what was happening. A violent red fire started in my stomach, creeped down my scalp, and singed the tips of my fingers. My ears swelled to twice their size. By the time the triage nurse came back, the fire gave way to ice, and I was shivering so hard it shook the hospital bed. She saw my toes tinged blue beneath the blanket and ran to find the doctor. I'd gone into shock. I became a mess of needles in whatever veins they could tap, took blood, delivered epinephrine, and filed fluids into my constricted veins. I remember sobbing, wishing my friends were there, wishing my mom was there, and wishing I was anywhere else. After a moment, I realized something beyond my own discomfort. I was not the first person to be trapped in the ER, utterly alone, and I certainly wasn't going to be the last. My suffering evaporated into a hot steam of frustration. So many people with preventable conditions, chronic disease, and injuries lived in this reality. I was one of the lucky ones. I would eventually leave behind the white walls. Over the next few years, I landed myself in the hospital more than I would have liked to. Doctors whispered terms like lupus and cancer, looking for a terrifying explanation to something painfully simple. It turned out that I was deathly allergic to a commonly used yellow azo dye. While it is banned in many countries globally, the FDA currently has no laws or restrictions surrounding its use. As I continued my health science studies, I could not forget the sorrow I felt in the hospital for others entering the healthcare system while already suffering. Soon I discovered public health in my elective courses, and it was love at first statistic. Public health has been an avenue for empowering myself and empowering others. My vocation now is to do the best I can to keep people out from under the fluorescent lights and under the blue sky instead.
So that's what a story from a researcher's perspective can look like. And in fact, I've got 3 people in a workshop right now who are researchers who are taking the workshop so that they can then know what it feels like before we work with them with their research subjects around cancer in East Asian women, I believe it is. So yeah. So we're going to do a little activity. So we're going to watch a story, which I will show you in a second, another story. And you can talk about all 3 of the stories that I've shown actually would work in these discussions. We're going to have a very brief discussion. When we go into our breakout rooms, I want you to talk about how you might use the story, this type of story in your research, and also ethical considerations of gathering and sharing stories, because I feel like we can't do this work without discussing the ethics of this work. So I'm going to just quickly show you this last story, and then I'll pop this back up so you can see it before we go into our breakout rooms. So here is, this is Jay's story called I Guess I Don't Hate Blueberries. It was also done in a workshop that was looking at mental health in young LGBTQ plus groups. I do have to say that there is a content advisory here. This story does touch on issues of child sex abuse. So I want you to just briefly, so just be aware of that. If that's something that triggers you, then I suggest turning off your volume or being prepared.
A psychiatrist told me that bad impulse control, PTSD, OCD, my gender identity, and my sexuality landed me in the hospital 3 times for suicide attempts. I knew differently. The sadness had finally caught up to me. It felt like thunder rolling through me. A few times my therapist asked me, how do you want to make sense of what is happening? And how do you want to go forward? But I wasn't sure if I wanted to go forward. For the first time, I was dealing with intense childhood trauma and assaults, and I couldn't imagine living with that. I went to the hospital, but not because I wanted to live or feel better. The people who loved me the most taught me that love is unconditional when they didn't give me the option to not go and fold in on myself. A fellow patient taught me that caring was possible when he brought me an orange and a sandwich when I was too sick from overdosing to eat with everyone else. During this time in therapy, I said, I hate everything. My therapist said, well, do you hate blueberries? And I said, okay, I guess I don't hate blueberries. And then he asked me what else I don't hate. Elephants, flowers, very old trees. Those things saved my life when looking into next week was too hard. I decided out of this time that I was going to be a therapist one day. I know that there are mental health professionals out there not doing a good job, especially for queer and trans folks, and I'm determined to be one of the good ones. I wasn't doing my life for myself yet, but for people like me who are getting hurt by a system that diagnoses and medicates when it should be listening and caring. Every time I paint, I let some of the hurt that I carry inside me rest somewhere else. I celebrate my goodness, and I celebrate that I'm here. My sadness doesn't roll and shake me like thunder as much now, but drips away cleanly like melting snow.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to the next slide. So these are our questions. So we're going to do about, I'm going to say 7 minutes. It's going to be a quick discussion, and then we'll come back and hopefully have a few minutes to debrief with the larger group. So again, you're going to talk about how you might use this story or any of the stories, storytelling in general, in your research, and also the ethical considerations of both gathering and sharing stories, a story like this, for example. So I think we're going to be popped into, join your breakout room. And I'll see some of you in one of them. So I just want to take a, well, I think people are still filtering back into the main room. I just want to take a couple minutes just to sort of debrief and see what people talked about in their rooms. So a couple people can unmute their mics. Oops, I can see this thing here. If anybody wants to see what you spoke about, I'm just curious. Let me go back to these things, these questions, how you might use stories and the ethical considerations of gathering and sharing stories. I saw Diane, I think you said that you had some good discussion, so I'm curious to know what people were talking about. Anybody wants to unmute their mic or put the chat? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ronnie. We talked about the power of stories, the power of that human connection and the connection to what's going on with people. And then one of our people in our group talked about how challenging it might be in terms of that ethical space in releasing those stories and going out into the big world, and how you can protect the privacy and the judgment and assumptions around some of those stories that might be out there in the public. And I didn't get a chance to say it, but I think about how much more effective that storytelling is in that digital form, rather than having those stories be told in a manuscript that only gets read by researchers. But that ethical piece is really tricky.
Yeah, it really is, which we'll talk about soon for sure. And of course, there's nothing perfect. We just do the best that we can, but we do have a pretty robust ethical guidelines, which I'm also really happy to share with people. Let's see, I think there's a couple things coming through in the chat too. I can't just see them properly. So yeah, Sandra, if you want to see what.
Yeah, so Allison just made a comment and she said, I don't know where to start in writing this into an information letter or consent form. So much is unknown when entering into this process and what might be uncovered. I feel informed consent is very hard.
Yeah, for sure. And again, we'll talk about that in a few seconds. Anybody else come up with anything interesting in there that they want to share back to the larger group?
Yeah, I think in our group, we had researchers and potential like patient participants. So it was really interesting to talk about both sides of the story and sort of hear where both people were coming from. So that was really cool.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay, I'm gonna move on. If feel free to put something in the chat if you think of anything else, or you can unmute your mic also and just interrupt. So don't worry about that. So I'm gonna go into our ethics. So as I was saying, Story Center sort of has this pretty robust form of ethical guidelines, we call them. Sorry, I'm just trying to, suddenly everything popped into places here. Okay. And we're looking at both the gathering, listening to, and sharing of stories. So again, if anybody wants to see this document, I am happy to email it to you. You can email me after this. So number one is, this is the most important: protect and enhance the storyteller well-being and safety. So I always begin my workshops with a story circle where everyone is given uninterrupted time to share his or her story and receive feedback. In setting up the story circle, we ensure the entire process is a safe space, and we work as a group to devise a set of guidelines to create that safe space. We do suggest using highly skilled facilitators appropriate for the level of support needed in a workshop. There's language challenges sometimes, computer use, cultural appropriateness, and emotionally difficult subject matters can often come up. So do we need to have certain support in the room? We'll figure this out beforehand or just outside of the room, because sometimes people don't want those people in the room, but they want to know that they're there if they need to step out. Oops. So here's the consent. Consent is a huge deal. We want to make sure everyone is fully aware at all times of the consequences of sharing stories, particularly vulnerable stories. In the end, in workshops that I run anyways, storytellers are the owners of their stories and can choose whether or not they wish to share their stories with Story Center or anyone else. I'd rather have people make the story they want and need to make and then decide afterwards if they feel comfortable sharing. And people can choose how to share, either for workshops or in conferences like this one, or educational purposes. And then there's a whole other level of sharing wider online that makes it hugely public. And if for some reason we work on a project where funders or an organization insists that stories be made public or be used for research, then storytellers are told this up front, and we work with them throughout the workshop to ensure that what they are creating is something that they will feel comfortable sharing. Storytellers have the right of freedom of expression in representing themselves in their stories. As facilitators, we provide storytellers with the space and flexibility to describe what they have experienced within the parameters or thematic concerns of a given project, and without being coerced or censored, as well as assist storytellers in determining whether or not it is safe for them to attach their names to their stories, and whether images of themselves or others should be blurred to protect their privacy and maintain their safety, or even their voices. While we do really want, as much as possible, people to speak in their own voice, we have had a couple times over the years that I've been working with Story Center, certain kinds of workshops, I think they were generally around domestic violence, where it was not safe for anything to identify the storyteller. And so we had one actor voice all the stories. So they were all done from that group. Any story can be created anonymously if that is what makes the storyteller feel most safe. So it's very important to keep people safe. Projects must be sensitive and appropriate to local contexts and needs. Facilitators should work with local partners to develop and carry out realistic plans for storyteller recruitment and advanced preparation. Generally, we feel it is not amazing to have people tell stories that they are in. It's usually good to tell, especially if they're really vulnerable stories. Most people need to be outside of their story so they have had time to reflect on what it is, and then they can talk about them. Every once in a while, that obviously can happen when people are in the moment, but usually we don't. If it's a very specific, vulnerable kind of issue, we want to make sure that the people who are recruited are ready to tell their stories and feel safe doing so. We conduct workshops in local languages with the help of interpreters where needed, and adapt workshop methods to fit local technological resources and capacities, emphasizing always the importance of first-person voice, group process, and participatory production. We are committed to assisting storytellers in making content decisions that ensure their dignity and safety, and where needed, protect their privacy. As I've said, ethics must be viewed as a process rather than as a one-off occasion of gaining consent. So it's not just a one and done. We have ongoing dialogue between storytellers, staff members, and partner organizations or institutions about how best to design and implement an ethically responsible project. And which is key to ethical practice. We perform ongoing communication with storytellers to address concerns that may arise for them following a workshop, and to involve them in any story distribution strategies if they desire to be part of it. So we are constantly checking in with people throughout the whole thing. And people can change their mind at any time. They might say, you can share my story today, and then a month from now, a year from now, they say they changed their mind. And then we take it offline, or however it is, like we remove them from our bank of stories that we share without, they own their stories. So ethical story distribution, we make sure that everyone understands the implications of making a story public, whether that means putting them on the internet or showing them at a public screening or support group or conference. So even though many individuals or groups are making stories to affect social change initiatives, they may find in the end that the story they made is just too personal and private to be shared broadly. On the flip side, viewing audiences are advised in advance when stories contain deeply sensitive materials and should be provided with opportunities to talk about what they have seen and heard. In addition, stories about highly sensitive, stigmatized topics should be shown only in carefully facilitated venues. We also ensure clarity and transparency among funders, partners, facilitators, and storytellers about workshops and story distribution goals and methods. We always make sure to advise of trigger warnings, both at in-person events as well as online if the stories are shared online. And again, I'm happy to send you our ethical practices if anybody is interested. My email will be at the end of this. So I could talk much more about ethics because it's such a huge, huge topic, but I want to make sure I have some other things as well.
Lanny, it's Sandra.
Yeah.
Nancy did mention that in the chat box that she's interested in the document. I have it pulled up if you want me to copy and paste it.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Or you can just put my email address into the chat box for people. Either way. Thank you.
I'll do both. Yeah.
Great. So, and then this is how to use stories in research. And I just want to get into this. I'm just seeing how much time we have. We don't have a huge amount of time, and I want to leave some time at like 5 minutes at the end for some questions. So these are just some like little tips for analysis. Like people are using stories told at the beginning of a research project as like a needs assessment or what needs to be looked at. What do we need to address in our research project? Sometimes, especially for longer multi-year projects, stories are told during or the midway point because they're looking at like, are we on the right track, or do we need to modify our inquiry at all? What can change, what can stay as is? And then stories that can be told at the end of the project to look at like, how did we do? What are the outcomes of our project or our work? You know, what did we learn from this project, for example? Plus, here's just a few tips for analyzing stories. You can take an emergent theme or look at a group of stories and look for emergent themes. This is kind of how I used mine when I did my research back in 2008. Representativeness, is it typical or unique? You can step back and look at patterns. Are there connections between events? Are a number of people saying the same thing? Is nobody saying the same thing? If you're using visuals, how often are certain images appearing? Describe the patterns in writing. How do the patterns relate back to your program? What kind of language are people using? Or, you know, depending on what your research question is, are they using the same language that you are, or have they been learning things? You can also ask other people from outside of the project to look at things to see if they see the same things or anything different. I was also going to say, I think I sort of mentioned this, but another thing that a lot of people do is they research the process as well as the stories. They can use sort of in focus groups. They can show the stories and have conversations with guided questions or facilitated prompts or something like this, and use that as part of their research as well. So we usually use writing prompts. I'm not going to do this now. I was going to do this when we were going to do this in person, have a writing prompt, but I just want to show you what it can look like. So this could be a potential writing prompt idea. I can, you know, you're welcome to try this. You know, I want to leave you with this exercise that we suddenly don't have time to do. But if anybody wants to see or is interested in seeing what it feels like to write a short personal reflection piece, you can try this. And we usually suggest taking some time to reflect. And then once you get started, write just straight for 15 minutes. It doesn't have to be perfectly written. You know, it's just a way to get some thoughts on paper and know what it feels like to tell a short, focused kind of story. So I'll just leave you with that. And really the rest of, we can have any questions. Any questions? I can go back to this so you can look at it. If anybody wants that. So yeah, I think we have, how much time do we have, Sandra? About 8 minutes, I think. So if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, 9 minutes, 8 minutes.
I think I can look at the chat now because I'm not. Thanks. Yes, so Sandra has put my email address in there. I'm always happy to answer questions going forward. So please feel free to get in touch with me if anybody has any questions. But if you have questions right now, please unmute yourself or want me to elaborate on anything I spoke about. I kind of went through stuff very quickly. I jammed quite a bit into this. But yeah.
So here's a question. Earlier on, you said that there are stories that avoid messaging. Doesn't every story have a message?
Yes, that's a good point. So I think what I meant by avoid messaging is like, we don't need the moral of the story spelled out for us at the end of the story. I think that people don't want to be told what to think about the story. They'll figure it out. So they don't want you to tell like a whole story and at the end say, and that's what I want you to think about it. You know, they want you to give your audiences and your viewers credit for being able to put 2 and 2 together. They'll figure it out because you figured it out in your story. You don't need to tell them what it is. Does that make sense? Especially, I think if you're doing some research with people, I think if you try to get them to put a message in, then they'll think that you have a specific agenda in your work. So if you just tell people just to tell the story, then you'll find that message in there. That answer that question?
Yeah, I think so. Any other questions from the audience? Feel free to unmute yourself or write it in the chat box. We have a few more minutes to the end of the session.
Tips for writing storytelling into grants. Yes. Okay. So I'm not 100% sure. Are you talking about writing writing the need to use storytelling into a grant? I'm assuming that's what you mean. It's not that hard because so many people see the value of storytelling right now, and we do a lot of collaborating on grants. Any of the, so we do kind of two different things at Story Center. We do what we call public workshops, which are fee for service. Anybody can come take the workshop and be part of it. And then most of what we do are what we call custom projects, where we partner with an organization or a university or public health or whatever it is, a group, and we help often write the grants. They're all funded, so the people taking the workshops actually aren't paying for them. And for, you remember the one with all the bubbles, you know, there's all different reasons that people might want to be part of, have their organization do a workshop. But we do a lot of, we do write a lot of the grants with people because we've got the language and we can explain the storytelling. But I think a lot of times, a lot of what we tend to say is that the value in it is putting the making into the hands of the storyteller. So they are representing themselves the way that they want to be represented. And it's a great way, depending on what kind of group you're working with, to elevate and prop up like marginalized voices who might not usually get a seat at the table. And now they get to talk about things the way they want to. I don't know that fully answered your question, Allison, but yeah. But yes, I mostly work based on grants. So yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, she responds, fantastic, thank you. So I think that you've answered her question. Any other questions from anyone?
Hello, this is Megan Brierly calling.
Oh, hi.
I have a question about an earlier example you gave about Thunder Bay aging in home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you said it changed policy. Any examples of stories changing other policies or medical education or even organizational practices?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is colleagues of mine in the US worked with foster youth that were aging out of the system, and that the laws around that and the policies were like not great. They're not very supportive. And a group of young people, I think around 18, I think is when they aged out. I think it was in Florida. And they made a group of stories. And then, they worked with facilitators on how to present it. We didn't just send them in like, you know, into the deep end. So they practiced presenting and knew how to talk about their stories. And then they went to the Florida legislature, I think it's called there, and they presented it to local governance, and they actually got some of the policies changed that would help them going forward to age out of the system better, so that they weren't just left out on their own. They were given some more support, and they eased them out of that transition. So that's one place that they were used very successfully. The Thunder Bay project has like taken on a life of its own. It's been used so many times over so many research, like so many people have used it. I've also done a project with recently, we did 2 rounds of it because the first round was successful. They decided to do a second round where we worked with newcomer and refugee Latinx transgender women who told the stories of where they'd come from and why they had to leave their countries and come to Canada. And I know a couple of them actually used them in their refugee status hearings, and it helped, those stories helped them get status in Canada. So that's another one where the stories were used. But that on an individual level, they weren't made necessarily for that, but I know a couple of the people, the women in those groups, used their stories because they told some very personal stories, but in a pretty safe way. So it was easier than just sitting in front of somebody and telling their story.
That's amazing.
Some other ones. Yeah.
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 So I think we're at 11:57. Unless someone has any final comments or questions, we're going to wrap up the session here in about a minute, just to have a few closing remarks to make before everyone jumps offline.
And here's my email address. Like, if anything else pops up, please, like, don't hesitate to email me. I like to hear from people all the time. It's better than doing admin work. So I'd like to answer people's questions more than I like to balance my checkbook kind of thing. So please feel free to get in touch with me if anybody has any ideas that they want to discuss. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Randy. And so I'll just close off the session. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for everyone for attending today. Please, we would like you to provide some feedback for this session. If you go and click Rate Session button on the session page in Whova to open the feedback form. We invite feedback from those of you attending live today, as well as from those of you watching the recording session later on. A reminder that our Twitter contest favorite poster and video abstract is still open. Please be sure to vote for your favorite. Winners will be announced after our closing plenary session on November 20th. And on Friday, please join us for our weekly virtual networking. Oh, that was, I think, just this past Friday that went by. So I think that's an old piece of information. Or Diane, is that also this coming Friday? Is it every Friday, the virtual networking?
It is every Friday, yes.
Oh, okay, great. So it's every Friday. Perfect. It's every Friday at noon in the Whova app. And so again, thank you so much for your time today, Rani. Great presentation, and thanks everyone who attended. It's great to see everyone here today.